for joining Jennifer Shelton and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email him directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. All right, just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C.-based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. This is an upcoming event that you can find more information here on our website. And we do offer advertising in our newsletter, so you can send an email to this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Anthony Ankeef, and he's going to be covering OTA's fine print, the details. Tony, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. And let's go on to the next page, please. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining me for what is the second of two webinars we're giving on other transaction agreements. In the first program, we set the stage and laid out the context. In this program, although we need to cover a bit of the ground and review what we touched on in the prior program, we're going to delve more into the details of the types of agreements. I have to tell you, however, that there are not going to be many hidden surprises, because what you're going to find, and what we found as we've worked with these, is that they're largely agreements that occur in the commercial environment. Let's turn the page, please. To begin with, we need to define what an OTA is, and it's kind of unique in the government sphere that there's not actually an affirmative definition of what it is. In this instance, OTAs are defined or characterized by what they're not. They are legally binding. Each agency that wants to use them has to be congressionally authorized. But the key point is that they have to be other than a contract, grant, or cooperative agreement subject to federal procurement laws and regulations. They are, in effect, a free-form commercial agreement. Next page, please. Next page, please. So what is this OTA environment? You know, OTAs originated back in 1958 during the space war, when the president was trying and Congress was trying to get companies to engage with the federal government to respond to the fact that Russia was winning the space race and had launched a dog into space. Since then, over the years, Congress has gradually granted OTA authority to most government agencies, which then in turn delegate that authority to government agencies. I think there are about 11 agencies and numerous subcomponents that have been granted this authority. DoD by far has been the most aggressive in its use of these. We've set out some of the agencies that have been identified that are major users. The intent of Congress in doing so is really to spur companies to bring their cutting edge and innovative capabilities into the public sector in solving the government's big problems, particularly when companies have not previously engaged with the government either because they weren't ready or didn't want to engage with what they thought was a bureaucratic morass. Let's go to the next page. So what are they used for? You know, OTAs cannot be used for situations that can be addressed either through FAR-based procurements or the grant and cooperative agreement system. The key is that they can only be used for addressing what are intractable issues. You know, the big challenge that government is facing that you can't just go out and buy or give a grant to do. And if you look at some of the things that are being developed, whether it's cutting edge work in the cyberspace, some innovative stuff by the FAA, the DoD, down to mundane stuff. The Army recently came up with the next generation of, or is coming up with the next generation of the means to deliver fuel and water effectively to troops at the front lines. So They're used when the government's facing this urgent issue and needs to draw on the best and brightest of industry, of academia, of finance, and have them work together to come up with an innovative and cutting-edge solution. So if you look on this slide, there are some examples of what some of the agencies have been doing. And let's move to the next page. So how do they work? Excuse me. You know, Congress, when it grants this authority, has not been uniform, so different agencies have been granted different authorities. But for the most part, they fall into three categories. On the one hand, there's this the use of R&D, which is, you know, really bringing out new cutting-edge research to be used for the government's prototypes. That has two things. It could be carrying on from an R&D project, or it could be advancing a product that exists, but moving on to the next generation. And as we'll talk about, this is new, a follow-on production contract without competition to produce a product from a successful prototype effort. And let's go to the next page, and we'll start to look at some of the ground rules. As I said, there's agency variation, and we're using DoD's program as a model just because it's the most active, and in part because the Other Transactions Guide, which came out last year, is really a good guide that explains what DoD is trying to do through its OTA program and what they look like. So the first, and they've established a number of ground rules that apply. So in the R&D context, they can be used when, as I said before, the normal contracts and grants don't work. Second, they can't be used to duplicate other DoD work. And third, when the private sector gets involved, it has to be a cost-sharing arrangement where the private sector picks up about 50% of the effort. Next slide, please. So prototyping is really the major aspect of what we're seeing today and where a lot of involvement is occurring. The concept of a prototype really has two. You're trying to enhance something or you're trying to improve something. And you're developing and beta testing and bringing to the fore something that works and would meet the standards of the government's need. The key here is really the second criteria, is that these programs, these OTA agreements for prototyping, have to have significant involvement by a non-traditional contractor or nonprofit research outfit or small business. And the regulation, the rules get into a little bit of how those mix. The key is that a non-traditional contractor doesn't necessarily need to be small. It merely has to be a contractor that has not in the last year been a prime or subcontractor required to participate or engage with full cost accounting standards, CAS standards. So it's possible that you have very large companies in the civilian space that don't engage in cost type contracting that can participate. And when we talk about the consortium arrangement and those agreements, that's an area where there can be some concern as to whether small companies get to participate. The third factor is that traditional contractors that are CAS-based or CAS-covered are allowed to participate under certain circumstances, but they have to pick up 33% of the cost of the project. If you think about some of the large contractors, a 30% participation fee is small potatoes when you can consider some of the rewards that come. Next slide, please. The golden egg of this whole process, which is new, is the potential for a sole source follow-on production contract. You know, this is and it has some significant criteria. First, the prototype itself, the prototype OTA that preceded it, had to specifically provide for a follow-on contract. We've run into some where it wasn't included, they wanted to award it, and they were forced to go back and run a competition. The prototype transaction must have been competitively awarded, so it could not be one of those arrangements where the government went and found a company on a one-off basis and did a prototype. It has to be a competition. And then third, the prototype has to have succeeded. And there have been some contests over that, whether they actually succeeded or not. But if you get through this, the theory that applies here is that OTAs were really developed at the beginning to buy knowledge in the research area. And what this shows is that along the way, the government has recognized that the opportunity to get a return on investment by being able to produce what might be a large production run, and also to commercialize in some instances the fruit of one's labor, is an additional incentive. Next page, please. So getting involved, and this is all leading up to the types of agreements to get involved. The government engages in two ways. On the one hand, the government may engage directly with potential participants. It can do that through broad agency announcements or requests for a certain type of proposal, or increasingly, it goes out to all sorts of new kinds of media that would be more frequented by the types of companies and institutions that they're trying to attract. And they may seek to have a short white paper submitted to them, and then either enter into a one-off agreement with an OTA, or they may be seeking to have a whole cadre of companies participate, and they may run a little consortium, or they may pick a company to run it directly for the government. The other way, the consortium route, is really what has become the major solution, particularly for the Department of Defense, but others as well. And what it involves is a group of traditional and non-traditional government contractors self-organizing around a specific technology area. So if you go Google consortia in the OTA consortia, you'll find that there have been scores developed over the last 20 years in almost every field. Tanks, planes, cyber, medical, the whole range, and they're increasingly becoming more refined. And as I said before, there's some very small ones, and then there's some of the gigantic ones, which have 1,000 or more members. The models vary considerably, but for the most part, they're consist of a simple application, a low membership fee, some of which is a flat fee, some depend on what your entry level is, and then the management. For the most part, there's a manager of the consortium. It could be self-managed, either by members of the consortium or an outside vendor. There are a number of companies out there increasingly that are becoming professional managers. The key, however, and the distinction that's important is that some of these managers really operate as a pass-through entity. They kind of collect the paper that the members develop as their white papers and shuttle them off to the government, and then shuttle paper down. Others are much more engaged in the process. They have technical subject matter experts. They assist the members in coming up with solutions and collaborating, and they're really part of the process. For the most part, these managers are nonprofits, and they're not allowed to participate in a substantive way, but they certainly can facilitate. And that's kind of a key part of the process. Let's move on into the OTA. Next slide, the OTA details of the government deal. And so here, let's just briefly talk about the process. The government has a problem, and so what it'll do is, as I said before, it'll issue a request for people to submit papers. Those papers come in, and after an initial review, if there are a lot of papers, a smaller set will be invited to come in and make a more formal presentation. Again, very, very short, maybe a 45-minute or hour long, following a 5-page paper, following an invitation that's but a page or two, proposing how to solve this. Often that solution will involve a host of companies coming together to bring their talents. Ultimately, the government will make a decision, and if it's in a standalone mode, they're going to issue an OTA directly to a company. In the consortium mode, they're going to issue an OTA to the consortium manager, who will be an intermediary between the government and the members. In both situations, there's some interesting characteristics about these OTAs. And there are not very many published online, but we've looked at a number of them, and they all seem to share some key characteristics, which is they look like a commercial agreement. They're no set format, although the government often, or increasingly, I should say, is proposing a model agreement when they start the process. But as they will acknowledge, this is really an opening offer, and pretty much every term in the agreement is subject to a negotiation. It's really a commercial contract that you need to negotiate in all your terms. So someone that's in the FAR environment who has never really negotiated may find themselves a little uncomfortable, in particular because there are no FAR clauses. So, you know, that means there's no TINA, there's no Contract Disputes Act or protests or costs or Buy America Act or audits, things like that. No changes clause, no termination clause. One has the ability to negotiate some of those clauses back in if they want, but not necessarily. The other thing one has to do is resist the temptation of some government officials to try and reimpose some FAR clauses in there. Although the government is supposed to handle OTAs outside of the contracting office of an agency, the fact is that that's honored in the breach all too often, and you may be dealing with a traditional contracting officer who needs to be educated. There's no preordained IP or data rights, and in an OTA environment, one doesn't necessarily have to think of the sort of three stages that are in the FAR. One can negotiate creatively as to the rights that one is going to get. It allows for flexibility and best practices in your industry. There's less oversight, there's less audit, there's less red tape, there's less reports, all of which are negotiated. There are some laws that continue to apply: criminal laws, false claims, some fiscal laws, civil rights laws, general applicability laws, and of course you have to be authorized to do business wherever you decide to set up. Also, the reason this is important is the OTA is going to govern your relationship for as long as it exists with the government. If you're in a consortium environment, it's going to cover the terms of the agreement that the consortium negotiates with you as you proceed through the project. And so here, leverage counts. To the extent that you are providing a critical solution and you're part of an OTA team or an OTA consortium, it is possible to secure some very favorable terms with the government. Next page, please. I think we need to go back one page, please. Yeah. So this is what the OTA, looks like if you get one. It's surprisingly like a commercial agreement. So I haven't gone into great detail on what is really a commercial transaction, but there are a couple of things I wanted to note. The statement of work may or may not be in a OTA. It will it'll always generally define the area that the OTA is engaged in, but it may vary. If the OTA is with direct from the government to the members, there might be a statement of work. The consortium agreement is likely to be more generalized, with the idea that specific statements of work will be issued when tasks are awarded down the process. Given the nature of the agencies that are involved, there may be restrictions on foreign participation, which is sometimes frustrating, particularly when there are companies in the U.S. that have foreign parents and get into the areas of classified work. You go through it, there are disputes clauses, patent rights, data rights. The difference from a government contract, and I keep beating this drum, is that these are all negotiable. And what one agreement will look like is totally different than the next. And so even though the government has models, really they are all one-offs when you get to the end of the day. And then there are the obvious things, as I said before, general laws of applicability, things like the Civil Rights Act, things like that will show up. There will be special agency rules. So for instance, the Department of Health and Human Services If you're dealing with live animal experiments or human experiments, there's special agency clauses that may actually have to be imposed, and then there are the standard terms. So let's go to the next page. So this one, when one is in the consortium environment, what one finds is that you've had the OTA, which is negotiated between the consortium manager and the government, and then you're awaiting the award of work. So the government will issue a series of issues or problems to be addressed or opportunities to be addressed by the team. In order to deal with that, the consortium members negotiate a consortium agreement or some kind of a sharing arrangement. And that agreement, I won't say it looks like a teaming agreement, it's more process-oriented. It sets out the rules of the road by which 5 or 1,000 members will participate together in trying to solve the government's problems. It talks about objectives and member requirements, the relationship, how projects will be assigned or made available to the team. For instance, in a lot of consortia, the only people that get to see the opportunities are the consortium members. There's one consortium, however, that posts all opportunities on its web. However, the only people that can actually participate in a program are members. But it throws it out to the world, and people, of course, can become members and then jump on the team. So these are all, again, negotiable. There are some antitrust considerations about not sharing price information and proprietary information, because these are collectives of companies that often compete against each other. And then there are various forms of dispute resolutions and standard agreements. Next page. The other aspect is, so once you have the consortium agreement in place, you're waiting for a project. And so there are two ways that consortiums handle this. Some consortiums pre-plan a bit, and they create a master project agreement. And the master project agreement will have a place, again, general statement of work, may have pre-negotiated prices, but it will have all of the substantive terms that are necessary for a company or a team of companies to perform work. And what is missing from that is the actual assignment from the agency. And when it comes and you have a master agreement, all you might get is a one-page problem statement that we need to come up with a new approach to a cybersecurity issue, or we need to have a solution to deliver fuel to the front lines, or we might have this airport issue. And they're negotiated on commercial terms and the like that. And then if the master agreement's in place, the specific project agreement is very short and simply refers back to the master agreement and the OTA. The alternative is that you might have a situation where a consortium doesn't have a master project agreement, although I think that's becoming less and less the case. In that instance, there'll be a specific project agreement that's tied to a specific assignment issued by the government. As a practical matter, it's going to be largely a form document that will be similar in all of them except the statement of work and the pricing for that particular project necessarily. What some companies find a little frustrating is that because there's an OTA on top of it, there's a little bit less freedom to negotiate a project agreement because it is subject to the OTA terms, not unlike the FAR flow-down clauses restrict some subcontracts. And then in the process, any member can go out and subcontract with a member company in the public to participate in that. Some companies don't want to become members of an OTA, but they get involved. That subcontract looks like any standard subcontract. It's a private arrangement. You do have to add OTA required clauses and the project agreement, so there are those limitations, but it really is a subcontract. Let's go to the next page. With all that in mind, are there any downsides to this? there are a lot of reasons to enter into it, the freedom of it. Some of the downsides that have been articulated is the discomfort that a traditional government contractor has in having to deal in a situation where you have to negotiate all your rights and there are no FAR clauses. One is always free to negotiate in some FAR-like clauses if you want. The government certainly tries to do so. There are limited protest protections. At the OTA level, the Court of Federal Claims, it says it has no jurisdiction. The GAO has said that it will consider only fundamental errors in approaching the OTA by the agency. The district courts review them under the Administrative Procedure Act. And if you're in a consortium, you do not get to protest the fact that you did not win a project. That might be a dispute that you handle internally, but there's no protest. One thing to keep in mind in a consortium, I keep bringing up these larger consortia. There are a number of companies that have expressed frustration with us, the fact that they've been participating for a year or two and have gotten no business, and that they have limited access to the government. There might be a whole number of reasons that they're not getting business that pertain to the company, but there is some concern that if awards are only being awarded to a small number of companies, there can be a problem there. Getting out of a consortium is as easy as getting in, as long as you're not performing on a project. So it's easy in and it's easy out. And one may go find something that is easier to use. And that brings us to the end. Let's go to the next slide. You know, the point that we're making here is that these kinds of vehicles are very attractive. They're not that difficult to negotiate. They are something that should be familiar to any entity that's in the commercial world, and even to you know, companies that operate in the civilian contract world with commercial items and things like that. If you're bringing a innovative solution, this is a wonderful way to expand one's business portfolio. And with that, I thank you for spending part of your afternoon with me, and I turn you back to Jennifer Schaus and company.
Thank you so much, Tony, for sharing your knowledge and insight. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact him directly with the email or phone number shown on your screen. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.